we are here to talk to you know them and you love them, and we're going to learn more about them in a different way tonight. So I'm going to introduce your esteemed professors really quickly, and then we're going to chat about how they got to where they are, how they became a college professor. All right, so first of all, we have Mr. Mike Brown, who graduated in 1987.
Don't do the math.
All right, he graduated actually with a BA in literature, but he fell in love with philosophy during his junior year. He came back to Christendom in '93 and held the Dean of Students position for 13 years, after which he switched to full-time teaching. By the way, he has a lot of stories from being a dean. He has served as an assistant professor of philosophy for the last 18 years. Additionally, he worked in the food business for over 15 years. And for 13 of those years, he co-owned a catering business through which he catered about 100 Christendom weddings, which is very impressive, yes. He has 2 daughters and a son, ages 26, 28, and 30. So, Mr. Brown is here. Thank you for being here. Next up, we have Dr. Hugh O'Donnell, who graduated in 2004. He has... He has spent his entire professional life in Catholic education. After he graduated from Christendom with a BA in English, he moved to Los Angeles, where he spent 12 years working at St. Monica Academy. There, he served in many capacities, including coaching sports, directing theater, and teaching theology, history, and Latin. Your Christendom education came in handy for that.
Right, yep.
After receiving 2 master's degrees in theology, he attended the University of Notre Dame, where his studies focused on patristics, the theology of religion and culture, and the thought of Joseph Ratzinger Benedict XVI. Hugh now resides in the Shenandoah Valley with his wife Catherine and their 7 children. He is an assistant professor of theology here. So, welcome, Dr. O'Donnell. All right. He got a second clap. Not keeping track. By the way, it is so hot in here. Thank you all for bearing with us. I don't know if you all are hot, but it is. We tried to cool it down, but Aaron made us shut the door so we don't have bugs. So we'll get through it. All right, and finally we have Dr. James Bergida, who graduated in 2009.
I'm the young man here.
He is a native Virginian, and he transferred to Christendom after his freshman year at Shenandoah University. After a few years in the workforce and a year of post-baccalaureate studies in Italy, he matriculated at the University of Oxford, where he earned his master's and doctorate. While at Oxford, he was a member of the Newman Society and the Oxford Union Debate Society. He has held several academic fellowships, including at Oxford and at George Mason University. In 2017, he received the Founders Award from the Society for Business Ethics. In the spring semester of 2021, he returned to Christendom and began teaching in the Department of Political Science. So, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. Okay, to give you a little background on this, you guys know I meet with lots and lots of students individually, and so often I hear, I want to go on and get a master's degree, a PhD. I want to become a college professor. I want to teach at that collegiate level. And so I figured, why not bring college professors in here to talk to you more about the nuts and bolts and how they actually made that happen. So why don't you start off, Mr. Brown, by telling us a little bit about how you came to be a professor?
My story is fairly simple. I would say it occurred in 1986 because if you fall in love, it changes your life. And I literally did fall in love in 1986. You may be thinking who that woman is. It was not a woman, unless you think philosophy is a lady. But there was a professor who came here in 1986 who was very instrumental in my life, as well as a colleague of mine who's currently here, as well as his brother, as well as 2 other gentlemen that went on to study philosophy. He was the first one to make philosophy real. And so I fell in love with philosophy in 1986, second semester. And at that point, I said, that's what I want to do. So I became intent on going to grad school. So I talked to him, asked him if he thought I was worthy of doing grad school. He told me he would write a letter of recommendation. So that's what I did. I went off to grad school. Excuse me. Ended up at Catholic U. While I was at Catholic U, A former friend of mine was the vice president for student affairs here. She called me up and said, Kristen's looking for a dean. Would you be interested in applying? And I said, well, would I be able to teach? And she said, let me work on that. So I came here in 1993 to be the dean, but I got permission to teach one philosophy class a semester. Found out that I was okay at it. So after doing the dean job for 13 years, I got permission from Dr. O'Donnell to switch over to full-time teaching. So that's literally my life story there in a nutshell. So,
Well, what did you study at CUA?
CUI studied philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah, so I did. So the idea was, as some of you know, I never did finish the PhD, but I went there to pursue a PhD, but I did terminate after I got the master's degree. So that was in 2000. If you're interested to know, I wrote my master's thesis on the topic of free will. So,
Okay.
so yeah, there it is.
Thank you. All right, and what about you?
So I graduated from Christendom, and I got a job teaching at a parochial school in Alexandria, Virginia. And I had no intention of being a teacher. I actually wanted to do acting. I was also in a band at the time, so I wanted to do music. And then I thought, okay, I'll just teach, fine. And I ended up loving it. And then after 1 year of that, I went to California. And as the bio said, I taught at a classical academy out there for 12 years. I met my wife. She was a teacher there. It was a teacher romance, which was fun and awkward for my brothers and sisters-in-law who I was teaching Latin to, and showing up on Friday night, knocking on the door, being like, "Oh, is your sister there?" And then the kids started coming, and I thought, well, I want to teach, but I want to do this for a career. And as you guys know, Southern California is very expensive. And so I thought, oh, maybe I'll be a professor, thinking that would be like a bump in pay, which that's another story. Okay. And so then I got a master's at Notre Dame. They have a great program there where you can actually do it during the summers, do some of it online, but then they hit you harder in the summer. So I would basically teach all year in Los Angeles, then get on the road, go to Notre Dame, spend the summers out there. And then when I graduated from my master's, I eventually went to Notre Dame for the doctorate. And that was a big decision because we were expecting, we had 3 kids at that time. And so I knew it was now or never. You can't drag this out. And so I went to Notre Dame, and that was great. I was there for 3 years doing graduate work, doctoral seminars, and candidacy exam. And then, so basically it's 2 years of coursework, and you do your languages, then you do your candidacy exam, and then it's 2 years to dissertate. So when I finished candidacy exams, COVID hit, and that was incredibly depressing because everything shut down. And South Bend is already, if any of you have been to South Bend, Indiana, it's an incredibly lonely place. Yes, it is. You stop seeing the sun for 3 months in the winter. And so I thought, well, all I have to do is dissertate. I don't have to be at the university, so why don't we move to Virginia, where my family is? And so we moved down here, and they needed a theology adjunct, so I started adjuncting while I was dissertating. And then they had a full position open up. I applied, got the job, and that's basically it.
Okay, awesome. And I'm going to ask later about the application process and interviewing process, because I assume that's an unknown to them. All right, and how did you get here?
Yeah, so I had actually wanted to be a professor even when I was a student here. I actually had thought about it even as a high schooler.
Wow.
So that's not typical at all by any means. And my great fear when I was here was I'm going to have to defend a thesis. So now I public speak about 10 hours a week. And at the time, I was afraid of those 7 minutes in front of a lectern. But at the time, I was a philosophy major. We ended up not having thesis defenses, so I was spared that. But when I was coming to my senior year, I had thought of going right into grad school. A number of my friends were. But I decided that I needed a break. So I decided this is something that I actually wanted to work in the real world. And I would highly advise that. It was a very good experience. I thought it was going to be 2 years. I was going to work in family business, and then I'd also been considering law school, so I said, let's try that out as well. So I got an internship at the Justice Department in DC for a summer, and realized that probably wasn't what I wanted to do, but it still was in the background. And during that time, I got this scholarship to go to Italy for a year. and I said, I want to go to Oxford, and maybe it would help if I did something, beyond just Christendom so that it helps my application stand out. And while I was there, I got accepted to Oxford, but for a number of different reasons, I ended up delaying 2 years. But I knew that I had been accepted, so that was going to happen. But when I got back to the US from Italy, I was like, I got to do something. And so I decided I'm going to go and work on a farm. And that's what I did for 2 years, which was a great experience, actually. You learn a lot of things about life on a farm. It made for all sorts of interesting jokes when I got into grad school. But also, my story also involves COVID. And so when I was finishing up my dissertation, I had been working alongside my graduate work and helping run a number of institutes at the university. And there was announced another lockdown. And I was like, it's time to go home. And so I had, I think, an email actually from Dr. Lane, where he said, I think there might actually be an opportunity to teach part-time at Christendom. And so it may have even been a year before. And so I think I wrote back to him and said, would that be possible like next semester? And he put me in touch with the political science and economics department, and it did work out. So I rolled in the fall, and then by January I was in the classroom.
Okay.
And I've been here since.
Nice. All right. Thank you for all that backstory. So let's talk about how you actually go about applying and picking a graduate program, because there are so many out there. And, I think the majority of you studied something different in undergrad than you got your PhD in. So where do you what advice do you have for the students? And then tell us about the application process. You can start.
Yeah, I think...
And, sorry, quickly, you were able to delay your acceptance to Oxford?
Yeah, so I was able to delay my start. And there was part of it was one of my supervisors was going on sabbatical. And so they said, well, it doesn't really make sense for you to spend a year here until he returns.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have been in philosophy. A lot of my interests are still in ethics. But I had already been thinking about economics. So my thesis while I was here was on intention in economics, but I was in the philosophy department. So it wasn't that big of a jump to continue sort of thinking about things in the marketplace from the point of view of ethics. But I think I realized, the way that they did philosophy in Oxford wasn't my cup of tea. So I had to think about, okay, how can I actually do the things that I want to do there? In a department that better fits me. So when I was in Italy, it was actually over Thanksgiving. You run into someone and they're like, you should meet my friend. So they had done an English doctorate there, and they said, meet my friend. And he was actually working for the Vatican. So he took me out to lunch, and it was really interesting because the Vatican, in some ways, it seems to operate very much like the departments in Washington, D.C. So we went to this sort of, looks like a very fancy mess hall, but it was all people who worked for different dicasteries of the Vatican. And so we had this lunch, we're talking, he's like, I think you would have fit in the department I was in, I'll put you in touch with my supervisor. And so it was through that connection I told his former supervisor what I was interested in. He says, yeah, I think there might be a fit. You should apply.
Okay. All right. So then how did you go about actually applying to that graduate program specifically?
Right. So, it'll be interesting to know how it works in the U.S. because I actually don't know in many ways.
Sure.
So often how I did it in some way the reverse order that you're supposed to do it is that usually you go and you look up, who's there, does it fit? I just went and contacted the people who I was hoping to work under. Often that happens at a later stage.
Okay.
But I found that actually quite helpful, talking to them directly, because you knew, is it worth my time even to apply? I applied some other places later on, because one thing that's different, I know, in Oxford than typically in the US, is you have to apply at each stage. So you apply for your master's as a separate program from the doctoral program.
Okay.
So at that first stage, having that conversation initially helped, because I knew, okay, at least there's a willingness. And because I knew that I wasn't had the exact background, but one great thing about being from Christendom is you've done certain things in the core or through your electives, so they can say, well, at least you have some background there. So we think you may have to do a little bit of catch up, but you're going to be okay.
Okay.
That's where it started. Then, there's an application process. You have to have a piece of writing that goes in. And so I took something I had worked on as an undergrad, but I perfected it and brought it up to snuff. And then just got the recommendations. Dr. Janislawski can still remember my frantic emails to him saying it's due right now. I need this in, or else I might not get accepted. He still remembers that.
Yeah.
I must have been really panicked.
Possibly. Okay, and so you had to submit writing samples, letters of recommendation. Was there an interview process? And I would love to know this for all of you.
Not for me.
No?
No.
You just send in your materials?
Often there will be an interview process. I sort of predid the interview process, but I certainly had that when I applied for the doctorate later on. Yeah.
Okay. Tell us about your experience. You briefly mentioned, James, that you sometimes have to contact who's there and who you want to study under, and do they have something that's a right fit? Did you experience that? And then tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so just to back up a little bit, I also majored in English like Mr. Brown here. And then it was actually through teaching that kind of discerned what I wanted to do. So as I said, I was interested in the arts, acting, and music. And then when I was teaching literature to a bunch of 8th graders, it's horrible. Right? I was like, what do you guys think about this poem? And it went absolutely nowhere. And then it was in kind of more theology and history that I was like, oh, this actually fits better. I didn't even know that. So there was kind of a shift there. And as James pointed out, right, the strength of the Christendom core is that you're going through so many humanities, so you can kind of actually navigate. If you get pulled more in a different direction. And I would think graduate schools actually don't care that much about, like, did you major in the specific subject? So, so doing that, as far as also his point about taking a gap, I think is really important, especially with the way graduate schools are very, very competitive. The application process, especially if you want to go to a graduate school with funding, can be very intense. So I would say it's good to have a 2-year plan, maybe even a 3-year plan. Just pause and say, okay, well, what does it look like to get into a program like this? And you want to decide what discipline you want to go into, but then for graduate study, right, it's a research degree. So you want to find out what exactly you want, like what area do you want to focus in on, and then when you frame your statement of intent, is what it's called. It's a horrible genre. It's like 2 pages long, basically, and you're telling them, this is why I'm a perfect fit for your program. And you guys are a perfect fit for me. And it's because my research interests perfectly match the scholars you have at your program. So you have to kind of do research at different places you're applying to. You might have to bend your interests a little bit towards what they specialize in, or it might fit like a glove. And in that process of 2 to 3 years, what you really want to work on, I would say, is, and again, if you go to Europe, you're not doing this, but the GRE, which is like the SAT on steroids. It's very intense, but it's very doable. I actually had a Christendom professor who said something, looking back, it was a little overwhelming. He said, take a practice test no more than 12 times, no less than 10. Wow. And I thought, well, that's crazy. But if you actually take the time to really study for the GRE and you take the test multiple times and you kind of get over that, I mean, it's something I think you really can master the exam. That's going to be huge because you might have great letters, you might have a good GPA, but that's kind of the equalizer. If they see your GRE scores are low, they might just dismiss your application. So I would really encourage students to work hard at getting a good GRE score. And then the other thing is languages. Right, and the humanities, they care a lot about languages. So if you can, on your application, say, like if you show up, you're like, I took some Latin, it's probably not gonna have much traction. You wanna have Latin, if you can do like a little bit. I mean, typically in the humanities, the 2 ancient languages are Latin and Greek, and then French and German. So those are the 4. And so you'd also be surprised with a little bit of work, like if you study French, and you take like the right book, and it's for reading, by the way, they don't care if you can speak it. And there's a great book out there, French for Reading. If you can like study it for 3 months, you could take an exam and probably score pretty highly on your aptitude for reading. That's going to really help your application. So the GRE, the languages, and then letters of reference. I'd say those are kind of the three key things. And especially if you can, as James was saying, contact a professor so you kind of have someone on the inside because some of these programs, they get like 200 applications. And if you've actually gone to the college, you've visited, you've actually interviewed on your own initiative the professors, and they get to know you, that's better than just being another name in the stack. So I would say those, your kind of human contacts, languages, and the GRE. And if that seems overwhelming, it's not if you space it out over a 2 or 3 year period. So that's what I would just say, take a breather, and that will also help you discern whether you want to do it. I knew people at Notre Dame who, one guy in particular, he basically finished his BA, went straight into his master's, then went straight into the PhD, and I thought it was actually kind of a disservice to him because he didn't have a lot of life experience and kind of, I don't know, basic wisdom, and that reflected in doctoral seminars. So I think it doesn't hurt and only helps if you take a little bit of time to prepare, so.
Okay, thank you. That was really helpful. And I will piggyback on the GRE. So hopefully you all sort of know this, most of you by now. I will reimburse you the cost of taking the GRE. So it is $222. You need to pay up front and then take the test and then send me your scores or tell me that you've completed it, and I will get you a reimbursement for the cost of that. Same goes for your LSATs, which are to get into law school, and your MCATs, if anybody's gonna go to med school, those kinds of things. So you guys can, I also have some prep books in my office, and I have some links to different prep materials so that you can study and take lots of practice exams. I have plenty of books. They're a little bit outdated possibly, but we've had students do very well on the GRE. And I would say that you must study the math because that is the downfall for Christendom students most often. So, okay, tell us a little bit about your experience.
I don't really have much to add to what they said. I wouldn't mind saying this to you all, though. If you are interested in grad school, I'm going to give you the brutal truth. Okay, Division I college athletes, about 2% of them, maybe even 1%, make it to the pros. Okay, among undergraduate students, I'm going to go ahead and be brutal. I think less than 10% should do grad studies. Okay, if you think you might be one of those 10%, can I make a strong suggestion? It's like discerning a vocation. You should go find someone who knows your work. That might be a professor here, and just have a brutal, honest conversation and say, do I have what it takes to do grad studies? Okay. If the answer is a resounding yes, and you have the interest, then I would recommend grad school for you. Okay. Now let me give you one more recommendation, and then I'm going to shut up. Okay.
No, don't shut
You
up.
should treat grad school like you did. I don't know if you only applied to Christendom, but what a lot of people did, what my own children did, they had top tier schools, the schools that they knew they could get into, and then like the middle ground. Okay, I'm going to say the same thing with grad school. You should try to get into the best institution you can get into. Here's why. At least in my field, I think their field, it's highly competitive. It is very challenging to get your foot into an interview. Okay, so something's going to have to stand out about you. There will be hundreds of applicants for one teaching position. If they see you graduated from a highly respectable graduate institution, that might catch their notice, okay? So I'm going to say to you, get into the best institution you can. So when you apply, you should go big, okay, but also have those middle schools and also have the lower schools that you could possibly get into. Final thing, I said that was the final thing. I have one more thing. Do not go into debt, okay? If the graduate school does not give you money, I would suggest not going there, because you will go into significant debt and you will have to build out of debt for years to come. Right? So that's my advice.
Okay, so I was actually going to ask the question, what does it take to get through graduate school? And so when you're saying, ask a professor who knows your work, do I have what it takes? What does that look like?
Well, I'll go ahead and say this. I would suggest, if it's possible, if you can make this happen in your life. First of all, I know Dr. O'Donnell did it while he was married. I would say, as a general rule, if you can do grad studies before you get married, all right, you will have a greater likelihood of doing everything you have to do, jump over all the hurdles, be able to dissertate, all right, without being under tremendous stress. So the goal would be, when you go to grad school, if you can, treat it like a full-time job and treat it that way. It is your full-time responsibility. That would be my number one recommendation about how to get through grad school.
Okay. Would you say that's the same for a master's program that's online? Because,
Yeah, that's a good, I don't know enough about, what do you all think? I don't know enough about.
Because I know there are some master's programs where, it's in the evening or
Right.
it's asynchronous, so somebody
Right.
could work a full-time job
True.
and then
Fair
do the
enough.
classes. But certainly a PhD, that's a little bit different than, some people just want a 2-year master's degree in something.
Can I give you guys, I just told my students this morning, someone just told me yesterday that Cardinal Newman, the famous Cardinal Newman, read 10 to 12 hours every day for months, often would skip meals in order to be able to continue to read, in order to take an honors exam at Trinity College at Oxford. And you ready for this? He flunked it, okay? He did not get honors. But I just want to tell you, if you're going
scaring them.
Well, here's what I want to say to you. You got to be darn good at it. So if you go to grad school half-hearted, you're going to waste your time. You got to try to be the best at it. And one way to be best is absolute commitment to it.
Okay. What do you all think it takes to
So I
make
would
it
agree with what Mike is saying. I would push back a little bit, though, with respect to being married and having kids. You also have to know yourself, because it was actually it was interesting at Notre Dame. So when I showed up, actually, a lot of fellow graduate students were married and had kids, although maybe it was only 1 or 2. But we were laughing because the married students, we were incredibly disciplined, right? Like we were waking up at 5 in the morning. We had a whole routine. I was also homeschooling at the time with the kids and had to give a certain amount of time every day to that. And then you'd see the single students and like preparing your candidacy, your third year, you're basically doing nothing but research for an entire year, preparing for these exams. They're 4-day-long exams, 3 days of written, 1 of oral. So it's very overwhelming. And you'd see the single ones and they talk about like, oh yeah, I got into this Netflix show and I just binge watched it. And I kind of got behind on my questions. And it's like, what are you talking about? So it seemed to me that a lot of times the married students were actually incredibly, you just don't have that option. But again, it could vary. It could be that you just get too behind. But I do think that Mike's absolutely right. Like it's a full commitment. And also depending on what situation you're in, if you're in a master's/PhD program and you're already going to go all the way through, you're in good shape. If you show up and you're a master's program and then they're going to take some students to go on to the PhD, then that means you have to be excellent from the very first day as far as giving yourself completely to it. And this is why you want to really discern in those, if you take the time off, do you want to do this? Because you have to love it. There's a reason why most scholars historically were celibates, right? It was almost a spousal devotion to their studies. And having kids, even now, it's a real juggle. And my colleagues and I, we laugh about like getting things published, like in all of our free time. So if you have to really love what you're studying. If you're like, I would like to do this, that would be cool, then graduate school's not for you. You have to, whatever you're going into, be I'm absolutely passionate about the church fathers, or I'm passionate about C.S. Lewis and his literature, whatever you decide to go into, just make sure that you really, really love it. So.
Okay, thank you.
To Professor Brown's point, I would add, so I think it's certainly you do want to talk to your professors as part of that discernment process, but think about what grad school is like and also what you're going to be doing afterwards. So, in grad school, especially in those final years, you're going to be writing a lot. So my degrees were mostly research. I spent the vast majority of my time by myself in a library, reading and writing. The best scholars I know, even who are in research universities, write for 4 hours every single day.
Wow.
And so you have to make sure that you like reading a lot, or at least can endure it a lot, and that you can write, that you're willing to write. It doesn't mean it has to be good every time, but you have to be willing to spend the time by yourself writing, and often alone. I, as a graduate student, I didn't necessarily have to get up as early, but sometimes I would get to the library quite early. And it was at that hour that you found the married professors who had kids, 5 a.m. in the morning, doing their research before they had a day of teaching, going to faculty meetings, etc. So there has to be a lot of discipline involved. So use that time to say, do you have the discipline? Do you actually like reading that much? Do you like writing that much?
And that makes me think of law school too, because obviously that's not the path that you all went, but I talked to so many students who want to go to law school. Reading and writing, you're doing that all the time, researching. So if you're thinking, oh, well, I don't want to do the humanities, I want to do law school, it's still the same amount of writing and research and reading. So keep that in mind. Okay.
And also real quick,
Yeah.
it actually you get used to it, right? It's not the same thing it is when you're an undergraduate. Like your thesis here, the big project, that's a term paper in graduate school, right? But it becomes very easy. I remember being an undergraduate writing my thesis and being overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, 30 to 40 pages. So it's something that you're just, all of a sudden, your dissertation's like a book. So you do get used to it, so don't be too overwhelmed.
May I add one more thing, is that part of that discernment process could help you to get funding. So if you use that time to write and you get something published, that makes you stand out. I remember some of the people who got the best funding packages had already published by the time they showed up on their first day of grad school.
Can you tell me what you mean by publish? Does
Yeah,
that mean
so
in
it
an
could mean that you
article?
could go into like a student undergrad journal at this point. It could even be some popular things. Some of them have published popular books. So some of my friends were in theology, and they had a popular book on theology, and they got funding in part because it says, here's someone who's disciplined enough to go through the process to get something, through a bunch of editors and to the public. And so even though the type of research would be different, having, that discipline demonstrated is huge.
Sure. Okay. So I'm sure we could keep going on how do you get into grad school, how do you succeed. Let's switch now to like current day. What is your day-to-day work actually like? What does a day look like as a professor? Because they all see you 3 hours a week, right? What do you do the rest of the time? Mike, you want to start?
Oh.
And because I know that you do so much extra on campus, what does that look like? Is this normal that you participate in all sorts of other activities on any other kind of campus? Would that be normal?
That's a tough question. One of you ready to answer?
It's just
What does your
really
day look
full.
like?
Your day's really full. So my wife and I homeschool. So the first part of the day is homeschooling, which is awesome, which is delightful. But that takes up the first, 2 hours. Then run here and teach for about 3 hours. And then after that's office hours. And then it's the end of the day and you haven't done that much prep for class yourself. So a lot of times you'll find yourself working on a Saturday, right? Certain times, I'm sure you guys have seen me in the cafeteria at dinner time. You're like, why are you here? And it's because, sorry to creep you out. I'm working late, right, till 9 o'clock, because that's when there's that deep work you can get into, sometimes little snippets of like an hour here, 2 hours there. It's when you're really getting into like 5 to 6 hours of intense work that you can get a lot done. Again, if you love it, then it works itself out. But I would say that's a big commitment also with respect to breaks. Like I do find it humorous when you run into the staff and the staff are like, oh, what are you doing for fall break? I'm like, working harder than you. Right, sorry, not to edit that. Not to be snarky, but like that's paper grading season, and that's when you're finally getting ahead of your stuff. So you don't really take a fall break or a spring, at least a newbie like me. Mike's more of a veteran. He might be going to the Bahamas. I find your breaks are very busy. Then you're doing finals. You can take off a little time at Christmas. Then Christmas break, you're preparing for your classes. And then summer comes along, and summer is, there's a small little window, but there's also a lot of stuff you'll be doing. And that's your time to do research and writing. Or you could do the summer camp here, the graduate school. So I would say it seems luxurious when you're, 4 months of the year are off, but it really doesn't work that way. The time is very precious.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about office hours when students are not there. So because I imagine you don't have a back-to-back, or maybe you do.
Office hours,
If students aren't there, it's computer chess for me. Trying to get better at it. Can I say this? This isn't quite what I do every day, but I will say this. One of the things that convinced me to get into philosophy was I heard an argument, and I found it very convincing, that there is no better pursuit in life than to pursue wisdom. Mm. You literally could say for any reason at all, it's the best thing you can do in your life. So I will say the kind of life that we have been fortunate to, either if you want to say God called us to it, is essentially that. It is a life where we're trying to become a little bit wiser And then what's really beautiful about the life, Aquinas made the case that the teaching life could be argued to be the best kind of life. And the reason he gave for that is because not only do you continue yourself to contemplate truth, all right, and try to order yourself to truth, but then you have the practical and wonderful job of trying to communicate that good of truth to someone else. And you could say literally there's probably nothing greater that you can do in life than try to bring someone else to truth. So I could say this is that in spite of all the headaches that might be involved in this life that I've chosen to live, it is a beautiful life, right? It is a life that I think has many joys to it. And I would say the number one joy for me is when I see a student is moved to wonder, is moved to love, is disposed to pursue wisdom. And then when I hear that happening in our graduates, our alumni continue to do that, and I've heard many, many cases where this is still true. They're still continuing to read the great works. They're still in love with intellectual things. There's no greater joy. So that's not really telling you what I do every day, but I just wanted to tell you, if it happens to be your calling, just know it's a great calling. So.
Wonderful. All right. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your day-to-day?
My day-to-day. Well, I've realized since teaching that I organize my life around semesters, because often people think in terms of months, but our schedules can change significantly between a fall semester and a spring semester, depending on the needs of the department, how we're organized, etc. But as a guiding principle for me is trying to have that deep work. That Dr. O'Donnell talking about is having that time set aside so that you can actually do the research, that you can do the prep that needs to happen, that you can be present when you're on campus. So I try to actually keep my teaching on a certain number of days and be fully present on those days, teaching. They're long hours, but then I'm able to pull myself away, do my prep, not worry about interruptions, etc. So it is structured. There's a lot of structure that you need to make it work so that we can actually get through a course on time. This semester, that means I get up at about 5:45 every morning on teaching days so that I'm ready for that full day in the classroom.
Okay, yeah. All right. Tell me about the job market in looking for jobs. And so you kind of all told us how you ended up here, and it sounds like there were some connections aspects getting you here. But do you know what it's like if they were to apply to other universities? This is part of the job search process that I don't know anything. How do you put your name out there? What does an interview look like when you are interviewing at a university or a college for a teaching job? You're like, yeah.
No? Yeah. I'm waiting for these gentlemen
Okay.
to.
Hugh.
Yeah, it probably depends. So theology is actually interesting because I think the market's actually pretty decent. There's a lot you can do with a theology degree. And if you were to look on a Google Jobs right now, you'd see tons of hires. And by tons, I mean like it's better than other disciplines. I understand other ones like history, for example. Graduate school has 200 applicants and there's several spots. There are places that are basically, they have one spot for one historian and they get 200 applicants. And you're going against people from Harvard. It's like, okay, what the heck? So it really does vary from humanity to humanity. I feel like for theology, especially with kind of wanting to be faithful, I'd say there are good job opportunities. It may not be exactly being a college professor, which is something else to consider because you might get a PhD and not be a college professor. I know for me, I actually just wanted the PhD. If I got the PhD and I went back to teaching high school, that would have been okay. So that's something else you can also discern in the process. Like, do you want this as basically a piece of paper so you can be a professor, or do you want it for its own sake? I would encourage you want the PhD for its own sake, not just a little obstacle you have to do to having this job as a professor, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What about you, James?
Some of the best advice on this that I got in grad school was, treat being a professor as being an entrepreneur. So in a sense, you have to, we talked about the discipline it takes, but there's a lot of organizing of your own life. Dr. Berzenak doesn't tell me how to organize my day. He asks me, what do you want to teach next semester? So there's a lot of things that I have to at least propose on my own. And also you have to think about, what do I want to research? No one's going to say, you should write this paper or try to write this book. That's something you have to figure out. So you have to think, what is actually going to make a contribution? What is something that if you're thinking about the job market, what are universities looking for? So I would encourage you, look at the different types of professors that are out there. There's a far wider variety than we have here on campus. And you think about we hinted at, salaries. Think about sort of what you need for your life plan. If you work in a business school or a law school as a professor, you're going to be paid a lot more. So think through that, because maybe it does mean going to law school and you want to be a professor. There are some great programs that will forgive your debt if you actually go on and become an academic in law. So, look at what the options are out there. So if you're in the medical sciences and you decide you want to become a professor in the medical sciences, there's always jobs, always jobs. So you might not be paid as much as you would if you were working full-time in a hospital, but if this is the life you want, there are those options.
I would add this, that your first, so let's go ahead and say your ABD, you still need to complete, excuse me.
All but dissertation.
Yeah, so you need to complete the dissertation. So one of your first things when you start thinking professionally, you got to get your foot in the door, so you got to get the interview invitation. So I think one of the best recommendations there is in your grad program, have at least one or two of the faculty in your grad program know you well. And if they can give you a strong recommendation, that will certainly help to get your foot in the door, so to speak. But also you need to make sure that what you're applying for, whatever position is available, is that you're fit for that position. So I will just tell you, when we were interviewing for a philosophy position a couple years ago, we received something like 40, 45 applications. And I would say 20 of those we immediately dismissed because they really had no qualification for the particular thing we were applying or offering or advertising. Okay, then the typical thing when you do get an interview would be to do a teaching demonstration as well as to give a paper, some kind of lecture, and then you'll go through an interview process. I will also tell you that in my years of listening to people who have been invited here for an interview, a lot of them fail at the teaching demonstration. It's surprising how few have the art of being able to teach. So I would just say, number one, if you do get an interview, try to slam dunk both your lecture as well as your teaching.
Okay. Can you all, somebody, maybe just one of you, quickly go over the different levels of being a professor? Like there's an assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. Then I know we don't have it here, but tenure. Anybody want to
So
take that?
adjunct's the bottom.
Oh, yes,
Adjunct is where you're an adjunct professor, you're just helping out, which actually, by the way, is a great thing for getting your foot in the door. I think all of us were adjuncts here, right? So that's the lowest rung. Then there is assistant, okay, professor. Then there's associate, and then full professor. So.
What does it take to move through the ranks, I guess?
So it depends actually, if you, at a typical university, I would think it has to do with your research and publication.
Yeah.
That's all they really care about. Publish or perish. At Christendom is based on three things. Researching and publication is just one of them. The other, I think, is, what is it, Mike? Is it
Teaching.
teaching excellence, and then a third is giving back to the community. And so actually you can take, as long as you're strong in two of the three, you can be promoted. So basically, if you're here, you get hired as an assistant, you're here and you teach for 6 years, you become an associate. And then it's, I think, a longer jump from associate to full professor. And they have a whole review where the faculty senate will look and say, well, do you have excellence in two of those three categories? That's for Christendom. But typically, I would think at another university, they want to know, your publications. So you could have a professor actually at a research university who's been there for 20, 25 years, and he's still just an associate professor. And then you could have another guy there for 7 years, and he's a full professor because he's just a publishing monster. So that's also a possibility.
Very interesting.
I'll add one other thing is that at a lot of research universities, they have postdoctoral fellowships or postdocs. And so a lot of academics that they think they're not ready to go on the full job market, they'll go and apply for one of these. They can be from a year to 5 years in length. And during that time, there's sometimes a teaching obligation, but generally it's the opportunity to start publishing things so that when you actually do enter the full job market, you have a book published and a number of articles as well.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. All right, so I want to switch to tell us what is difficult about being a professor. Maybe a specific time you've struggled or a thing that you run into regularly that's kind of hard about this job. Don't name any names, but in general, what is difficult? James?
Ooh. Well, this is more of something that's not necessarily the case now, but I remember when I first going into teaching, I came from an environment that it was a lot of one-on-one teaching, and then having to go into a classroom teaching is a very different animal. And so that was a real difficulty for me at first, making that transition. And here I try to have a balance between some lecturing and a lot of discussion as well. But that was a real challenge at first because from how my grad school worked, there was a lot of discussion. And having to say, oh, I have to maybe talk for 10 minutes straight without any reaction from the students was a real challenge at first.
Okay. Yeah. What about you, Hugh?
I would say it probably has to do with time. Time is the greatest challenge and difficulty. I want to reiterate what Mike was saying about the beauty of teaching and how wonderful it is. I mean, a bad day teaching is a good day. It's an amazing thing to be able to be a teacher. It's like, sometimes you can, feel sorry for yourself, like, oh, I have to go read this church father and I'm tired. You're like, you get to get paid to read a church father. Like, what's wrong with you? So, but I would say it's the hardest thing, I think, is the time management, because especially if you have other obligations, family has to come first. And so that's its own thing. And there's obviously, thesis advising. There's just a lot of good things that you're doing, and it's just hard to juggle. And a lot of times I found my greatest difficulty at Christendom is not getting the time to do my writing projects that I would love to do. I have a whole word file of things to do, but it doesn't seem to happen just yet. So I would say it's just more that frustration as opposed to, oh, there's some particularly horrible part about the job. I would say no, it's just there's too much good stuff and you're just spread very thin.
I wouldn't mind just say this to you all. As a teacher, my greatest difficulty is what I would call a discouragement. And what I mean by that is when I sense that students aren't falling in love with what I think is lovable, I find that a tremendous difficulty as a teacher. And then what I go back to St. Catherine of Siena, where she supposedly went into a prison cell of a young man who was awaiting execution. He refused to see any priest, but she got permission to go into his cell by herself. She managed to convert him, but he was so scared of dying that she agreed to go to the scaffold, and she held his head while he was executed. Okay, I just want you to imagine that soul going to heaven, and when St. Catherine was there, could you imagine the incredible gratitude? He was probably going to end up in hell, but because of her intercession, all right, he got the greatest gift of all. So I want to say what is encouraging is when we do see students being moved and falling in love and beginning to have the desire for wisdom and the desire for deeper things. So when I get discouraged, that's what I go back to. And I will say the beautiful thing about teaching you all is that in my years, most students here are very well disposed and are very much moved by the deeper things.
So kind of piggybacking on that, can you tell us about a time that you had a big success with a student or something you're really proud of in your time
Well,
here?
I will say this. I just recently got invited by 12 men, all of whom had graduated from Christendom. They've been out of Christendom for about 15 years, and they have been faithfully every month getting together, either reading a text or having someone come in to speak to them. They've been doing this for, sorry. They've been doing this for 12 years.
Wow.
That was a tremendous consolation for me.
Yeah.
All of them are married, all of them have kids, but they still are pursuing what I would call, just the better things. So for me, it was a tremendous gift to go up there and see what they've been doing and to see how they're still alive. So.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Hugh?
I don't know how much of a success. Well, I would relate this actually. One of his success stories was actually me.
Oh, do tell.
So when I was a junior here, I took medieval philosophy with Mr. Brown, and it was really a life-changing class. So he was the dean also, and I basically lived in his office. He could vouch for that, getting in trouble quite a bit. And he really helped me through his medieval philosophy class, kind of turn my life around. We read Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, and I just thought of holiness as like holy rollers who looked really miserable, and I wasn't really drawn towards that at all. And then when I read Boethius, do you guys read that in the core? Okay, good. When I read that book, I was like, wow, virtue is rewarding for its own sake. And so I owe a lot to Mr. Brown, actually, so I'd say I'm one of his success stories.
Can I just say something real quickly?
Only if it's about what he got in
Okay,
trouble for. Yes,
I
please.
will. All right, here it goes. In his section, I got the most interesting student evaluation of all time. To this day, I don't know what it meant, but I know it was negative. The comment was simply, Mr. Brown, you are a resounding cheese board. I have no idea what that means, but I know it's negative. So.
I don't know how we continue on
Yeah, I
after that.
know.
I don't know what I can say
Sorry,
after this.
James.
Tell us about the profound
profound
moments you've had here.
For me, it's often when the alumni come back and you see them doing well. So I had my first semester here. I was teaching a night class, and I had a couple in that class. They later got married. I went to their wedding. They both became teachers. They're doing very, very well. And then they brought their child back recently, and I saw them, it was earlier this semester, and it was just a wonderful moment to see how successful they are. And even though I had them for just one course, you felt like I contributed to this, and at least in a little way.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now for kind of a fun question. Tell us what you were like in their shoes as a college student. What were you like as a freshman, as a sophomore? Give us the rundown. Who's going to be brave enough to go first?
Well, all sorts of things like flashed through my mind. So one idea was I liked, my weight room. But also I was a bit of a nerd. So I wanted to start a group called the Sumas, and we would go into the weight room together and, work out. So that was part of me. I was also doing my logic in the closet in Joe's late at night with the light on as my roommates were sleeping. So yeah, that's a couple of images of me as an undergrad here.
Okay. Anybody willing to take us to Sumas? He'll be your advisor.
Do we have to be honest about this?
Nope. I won't know. I won't be fact checking you.
If I were to be honest, I was actually a pretty bad student. I had so much fun that studies tended to become secondary. So I hate to admit that, but that is actually true. I will say my best semester, and let me just encourage you to think about doing this, is where I made a very firm commitment to set aside 2 hours every day, and I made those 2 hours sacred, and I was going to focus on any schoolwork I had to get done, and I did that faithfully throughout the semester, so that at the end of the semester, I actually felt pretty good about myself. and it actually was my most productive and best GPA that I acquired. So, so I, I don't know if I really answered your question as a student. Yeah, I would say the pivotal moment for me was in my junior year when I got really, like, when philosophy became alive. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say the same, basically. I had an intense intellectual and spiritual conversion my junior year. And the semester to Rome also helped. His class then forwarded into the semester in Rome was awesome. And I did not do my work the first 2 years at all, do any of my readings. And then something just kind of flipped the switch junior year. And then I found myself going and kind of making up for lost time. So once I graduated and I was teaching, I would spend my nights reading the Iliad, reading the Republic, all the works that I'd missed out on, which I know sounds nerdy, but it was actually really, really exciting. So I kind of made up for lost time, and that kind of caught fire with the whole intellectual life further. So it's never too late, right? So if you skip readings, you have the rest of your life. Hopefully a Christendom graduate is someone who's successful, but it's somebody who wants to return to read the great works, right? That when you guys are 30, you're picking up Dante, or when you're 40, you're like, let's go back to Chaucer. I think that's the sign of, a good graduate.
Okay. All right. We'll end on this, sort of, because we'll open it up to questions to you all. So much has changed about Christendom, especially since you were here. We've got new buildings, we've got a new chapel, we've got new programs, all this kind of stuff. But what hasn't changed about Christendom? Mike, you gotta answer.
If I were to say what has not changed, frankly, I would say our students. You're essentially the same kind of student. I would say, here's what I mean by that is, if I were to classify you as a person, as a student, I would say that was basically what I would have said 30 years ago when I first started here. So I'm going to say great hearts, well-disposed, very teachable. The kind of people that, I fundamentally like. So I would say, what I would say in 30 years, I would say that's the biggest blessing, would be you all. And I think that's gone unchanged.
Okay.
Now, you might be worse spellers than students. I always tell students my favorite misspelling. Can I go ahead and let you guys know?
Please.
It was the word that I first learned to spell. I even learned it, I think, when I was born. It was money. Okay. So I once had a junior put money in my mailbox, left a note, and said, "Here is my money." All right. Now, if you think this is the way it should be spelled, I fear for your life. Okay. But it was Monneey.
Oh.
Monet. But anyway, so that's what I would say is essentially unchanged, or is you all. Yeah.
Okay.
I would say just the ethos of the college seems the same from when I was here over 20 years ago. You walk around, and it probably in large part is because the students are the same and the faculty. There's just a common ethos. Can I say something that I think has changed?
Yeah.
Food. Like the food here has gotten a lot better
Yes.
than when
You don't know how good you
when
have
I
it.
was a student. So I just want to throw that out there.
On the food note, it's actually not about the food, but you may hear the echo in here. They didn't used to have the sound paneling in the commons. You could not have a conversation during lunch. You could basically yell at the person next to you or across from you, but otherwise you could not have a conversation. So it's actually relatively pleasant to actually go and have a meal now. It was not the case.
The food is better, the sound
food's
is better.
the sound's better, it's far better. So on the way in here, and I know Dr. O'Donnell was there as well, I stopped in the chapel, and even though it's a different space, we're not in this space anymore, the same devotion is amongst our student body. And that was a beautiful thing to see. It was, we have the same statues. The statue of Mary used to be right here, and I know how many generations of students have knelt in front of that statue, bringing their cares, problems, And sort of seeing that again and saying it's a wonderful thing to see that as still there, still present.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Okay, where is Sunny? Sunny's got the microphone. Okay, so she is gonna walk around and answer questions. So raise your hand if you've got one. And then I do, if we want to start with Jillian here, and then I would love to wrap up after they're done asking, just like any other tips, any comments, things that you wanted to share that we didn't get to today. So, Jillian. Can you go ahead and stand up?
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Oh, now it works.
Yes.
So how did you all support yourselves financially during grad school, pay for grad school, especially Dr. O'Donnell having a family? Also for Dr. O'Donnell, when you had a family, did you feel like you got a lot of support from them while you were in school?
No, that's a great question. So the biggest obstacle, so my wife was born and raised in Southern California, and I wanted to go to South Bend, Indiana. So that was, right, we had a stable job in California, so that was the biggest thing, and she's a wonderful woman, and so she said, if you want to do this, let's do this. So that was amazing. So overall, the support, I would say, from the family was tremendous inside my own particular family and then outside of it. As far as support, so Notre Dame, the stipend was $23,000 a year, and it was awesome. It was actually some of the happiest years of our life because we had 2 cars, we got rid of 1 car, and we just had the 1 car. We got rid of cell phones. We didn't have cell phones. We basically went through our budget and just sliced everything, and we had to be so careful with our money. And I almost wanted to get a sweatshirt made like Aldi, making grad school possible. I mean, the prices have actually, since the economics the past several years have gone up. I mean, Aldi used to be like $1.25 for a thing of granola bars, and so I would say we were forced to live on a tight budget, but it was actually it was a good lesson in what our Lord says about blessed are the poor, because it was actually, I'd say, almost happier than when you have more money, right? Because you're forced to be disciplined. Christmas means so much when you're giving a gift because you're really sacrificing, right? Like, this means if we're getting this, we're not going to get this. So, yeah, I don't know if that, does that answer your question basically, but it's you can do it. I have some money saved up, but if you're really judicious, you can do it even with a family. And we were open to life. We had, a 4th kid and then soon a 5th. And so God takes care, he'll provide.
Was there a hand over here? Yes.
Thank you, professors, for speaking to us today. It came up a couple times that research and reading is really a big part of the grad school life. I was wondering if maybe you could expand on exactly how much time you as professors have for research and reading today as professors. Do you graduate from grad school and then that's kind of the amount of learning you've done and you peak there and that's just what you teach, or do you keep on learning and growing in knowledge as you're a professor from research? Thank you.
James, you want to take that?
Yeah, so it depends on which university you're at. So here we have a very large teaching load. We focus on teaching. So we have typically a 4-4 is what it's called in sort of the industry. So we have 4 courses that we teach in one semester, 4 in the other. If you're at a large research university, you may be doing a 1-1 or a 2-2 at a not as large of a research university. So in those instances, there's an expectation that you're going to be doing a lot more research, that you're primarily a researcher. So this is for us, I think, and I'd be interested for what you experienced. Summers become even more important for us because it's not during the semester that we're doing as much additional research. We may be prepping for a course that we haven't taught before, so there's some research associated with that. But generally, at least for me, my writing takes place during breaks.
Okay. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I would second that. And a lot of times when you're doing prep, that is your research. The theology department's wonderful. We'll get together, we'll talk about electives. And I mean, when you're doing a new prep, that's tons of research. So for example, I was speaking with my colleagues about writing a book on the angels, a project I've wanted to do, and they said, well, why don't you teach angelology so you can kind of kill two birds with one stone? But every time, at Christendom, when we come to the classroom, whatever we're showing that 50-minute, hour, 15-minute period, there's been a lot of research that's gone into that. But it's not as much as graduate school.
All right, next one, you have over here.
So I feel like two things you have talked about is kind of in applications or in writing, focusing on what things the fields want, I guess, what your given field is kind of interested in, or things that are big in that field. But also kind of the idea of being in love with the wisdom or, what you want to learn about and what you want to research. And I guess I was just wondering, it seems like those two things could be in tension at certain times, and kind of how you balance that.
Is that a tough one?
I'll give an example. So I was applying for the doctoral program, and I knew what I was interested in. I was interested in ethics as applied to economics. And I knew that the market where I wasn't, if I had said something that was completely Catholic-oriented, there wouldn't have been an interest there. So I looked at, what was possible, and so I did a comparative study with Islam, and I got the funding. So I was able to look at what I was actually interested in, but I was able to also meet what the university was interested in as well. And so I grew through that process. I learned a lot more about that religion than I ever knew before, but I was able to do what I actually wanted to do while finding something that the university was willing to fund.
Yeah, that can be actually a helpful process too, because a lot of times you're like, oh, they're more interested in this, but sometimes, it's not all bad. They might be interested in the field because it's worth exploring. I actually had a similar thing to James. I ended up basically minoring in Islamic studies at Notre Dame, and it led me to really fascinating areas about the interaction between Christianity and Islam, especially with Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter the Venerable, who was the first one to have the Quran translated into Latin. So it kind of forced me out of my comfort zone where I was more interested in the church fathers. And a lot of times when you're kind of, oh, okay, I could go in this area, it ends up being a great benefit. I became very fascinated with Islam and kind of the historic encounter, and then you start reading Thomas Aquinas, because Thomas is using Islamic thinkers, and it kind of actually, if anything, kind of broadens your horizons. It can be helpful when you try and cater a little bit, as long as you're being faithful to yourself.
All right, who's next? Come on around. How many others have questions? Okay, a few more. Oh, up front.
Hi. So since we all know how easy teaching is, what pet peeves did you manage to gain once you started teaching as a professor, and how were you able to handle them?
I missed
Pet
it.
peeves from the students? Okay, I don't know.
Students not doing their reading.
Oh.
Yes, okay. Other pet peeves you've had in the classroom?
Well, I hate to bring this up, but you guys, when I listen to a homily, I'm going to be honest, many times I actually don't listen, but at least I have enough respect to give the facial representation that I am intent. I will say that that is a pet peeve for me. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes I misread my students. I've reacted negatively at times based on what I am perceiving, and that's not always true. So I would say the student that shows interest and appears to be focused is a really nice student to have.
Good spin on that. Anything else to add? Okay. Did we have one up here? Okay. Well, let's do back here. Sunny's already back here. Alex, she's coming, and then we'll come up front.
So, was there ever like a rock bottom moment for any of you where you basically were like, man, should I be going down this profession? Should I be teaching? Should I be doing this for the rest of my life? And if there was a moment, then, well, how do you pick yourself up from that?
That's an interesting question.
That's a very good question. You make us sound like alcoholics that have to hit rock bottom to recover. I actually don't think I've ever had like a rock bottom moment. Maybe I'm just not being honest about that, but can you guys think of anything that you would say was like, I will say this, I was at one point seriously contemplating quitting or like giving up what I'm doing here and be a full-time caterer. There is something really nice about running your own business. So I did run a very successful catering business for 13 years, believe it or not, while I was working here full-time. So we averaged about 700, 800,000 of revenue a year. We were known as one of the best caterers in the area. We were quite good at it. I even thought I was better at catering than teaching. So I will say I was seriously tempted to go in that direction. So that might have been a kind of rock bottom moment for me, that strong temptation to do something else. The grass is greener. The way I got through that was I ultimately realized there is something good about providing good food, providing good service. Ultimately, though, I will say that I thought in comparison with what I'm doing here, it would be fairly empty.
Sure. So. Did you all have a time when you reconsidered or thought about, why am I doing this?
I know I was afraid of going to graduate school because I was afraid of intellectual hubris. Have you guys ever had that temptation? Like, is this kind of burning incense to my own intellectual ego? And quite the opposite can happen in graduate school. I found my first year of doctoral seminars, I was just blown away by the caliber of students. My colleagues were so bright, so well read. I felt so far behind. And that'll happen in graduate school. There's a certain lingo. Everyone's talking about these theologians, these French theologians. I'm like, I know St. Augustine. Right? So you get acclimated very quickly. But there were moments that first year where it's like, especially when I had left everything in California and I was in, you're just like, is this the right course of action? So there was a little bit of that, but never like total confusion. Also, it's hard too because you're pursuing an intellectual good, but it's so intellectual. Sometimes you're like, you see Mother Teresa's nuns, you think, I should just go like help the poor, do something. And so to have the faith that actually you are serving God in that way with your mind and your studies, and to have the faith, because there can be a temptation to be like, I'll start doing these other things, and like, no, that's where you're in the heart of the church trying to be a good theologian, a good intellectual. So.
Probably my first term as a graduate student, I really thought, I'm just going to call it quits. I think part of it was that there were some very challenging ideas I had to grapple with during that time, and also I had been out for a long time. And so sort of getting back into the discipline of regular study was a real challenge. But I remember a couple of calls home, but also I was dealing with a different culture. So it was just all those things pouring in all at once. And I remember being encouraged by one of my brothers, hang in there through the end of the term. And so when I got a break, got some space from it, I was able to say, this actually, I do care about this. I'm going to persevere. But so that was, probably the lowest point for me was at the beginning.
Yeah. Do we have a question up here? And maybe one more after that, if we've got one.
So on the subject of jobs, was it at all possible, and if so, how difficult was it to have any kind of job while you were going through your studies?
Can you work during grad school?
Yes, during the summers, you can work. And I worked, part of the supporting family, going back to the supporting family question was, I worked like crazy during the summers. The summers in Notre Dame when you do your languages, and so for my program, it was 4 languages you had to have reading competence in. So I would do my language studies on my own during the semester so that then my summers were free to make money. So during the semester, for me, it was out of the question. But during the summers, I would do anything and everything I could to make money.
Okay. James, what about you?
You can, in my situation, I could and I did. The trade-off, though, is that you end up staying in grad school longer. So, some people who had, more money at their disposal may have actually, not had to do that. So you have to kind of balance that, because as a grad student, you're going to make a lot less money than you would afterwards as well. So it's like, is it worth it or not? So there's can be a temptation to work too much and not focus enough on your studies.
A lot of it, I think, would depend on your own personal situation. If you have to work, you have to work. If you can't make ends meet unless you hold a side job, you have to hold a side job. You just have to make it work. But the ideal would be not having to hold a second job, a job while you're in grad school. That would be the goal.
There are a lot of places that will offer you an assistantship.
Right.
So especially for master's programs, you can do a graduate assistantship on campus where you're just working in one of the offices. It doesn't have to do anything with what you're studying, but it's cheaper labor for them to keep the college running. So there are those, and then of course teaching assistantships as well. So there's ways that it can overlap with what you're doing, and you could be working for the institution and not trying to do jobs on the side. So there's lots of different options for sure. Do we have one last question? Oh, okay, we have 3 questions. Bridget up here, and then we'll take one more from Faustina.
Were there any courses or mentors that helped you develop your specific teaching style, or did it come fairly naturally with time and practice?
Who influenced you in your teaching style?
Well, Lucy, I hate to do this, but her grandfather was a tremendous inspiration on how to teach well. I got the benefit. Her grandfather is one of the greatest men of the last 30 years. I really mean that. A remarkable man. He was an embodiment of what it means to be wise. And when he taught, it was like truth was on his fingertips. And he could see a lot in very little. So my goal in life is to see a little bit like how he saw things. So for me, that was a tremendous inspiration. I took one class, and for me, that was like a life-changing moment.
Okay.
His name is Dwayne Berkowitz, by the way. So if you ever want to go online, put in Dwayne Berkowitz's articles. He also has lectures. He is absolutely worth listening to. You can learn a tremendous amount from that man. So.
Okay. You?
Not really.
Okay. Honesty. That's great.
We did have some teaching. I guess we were told how to teach to some extent and given some tips. And I found those certainly helpful, but I also took it into my own hands because I knew I wanted to eventually teach in the U.S. and I was learning a British system. So I went and took a teaching, like a weekend course at Georgetown, and I found that incredibly helpful, actually. And they have some interesting methods that they were sort of filling us in that they do differently than other places. So I've taken bits and pieces from these different experiences into the classroom.
Okay. Thank you. All right, final question up here.
The snacks were advertised as the professor's choices, so which professor chose the Doritos is what I want to know. Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you all so much for the great questions. Any last comments, thoughts that we didn't get to, questions you were hoping that we would discuss that you want to?
I wouldn't mind saying one thing, and then I'll shut up. You guys, the best commencement address I ever heard was not at Christendom College, okay? It was at a culinary school, and it was by a chef of a 3 Michelin star restaurant. He had one single message, and I thought it was a brilliant message. It universally applies. He said, I promise you, you will be successful if you do one thing and you do it the best. He said, if you make the best hot dog, I guarantee you, you will succeed. So I think that would be my suggestion, no matter what you do in your life, okay, make that be your goal, that you will be the best at that you could possibly be. And if you could actually say you're the best at it in the world, 2 thumbs up for you. So that would be a piece of advice I would give you.
Do either of you have last words?
I would say the whole graduate school process can be very daunting at first. I know when I was in your position, I was very overwhelmed. And I would say don't get discouraged. It's just one of those things where if you actually, that's why I encourage that time period of 2 to 3 years to do the prep. And that's actually a good trial run. Like the process of studying for the GRE will make you, you might actually nerd out and enjoy that. Or studying languages, like that's a big part of academics. You might find that you love studying languages. So like when I was preparing for graduate school, I had to do a lot of Latin, but there was no time. So I woke up at 4 in the morning, I was studying Latin, and I ended up loving it. I love waking up at 4 in the morning, and I got 2 hours in of just doing Lingua Latina, especially volume 2. I don't know if you guys have ever gotten to volume 2, right? And it just became absolute delight. And then I made one of my best friends through this experience because, Aristotle said, the transcendental third of friendship, it was Latin. We would corner each other at parties. We'd say, I think I understand the essence of the ablative, and everyone would walk away. So take your time, and I would say don't be overwhelmed because it's all going to fall into place as long as it's kind of like the one who's consistent and steady is going to end up succeeding.
It's something that Mr. Brown said is, it is a great life. Maybe there's a lot of challenges in pursuing this career in the day-to-day, but it is a great life. And one thing that's great about grad school is that you actually get to start living that life in school. You're not like, waiting for when I'm finished. You actually are already getting to pursue that life, do many of the things that you will do once you finish. You often will do teaching while you're in grad school. You'll be doing research when you're in grad school. So yes, it may be even more intense than your day-to-day as a professor, but you actually, from day one, get to start doing some of the things that if you want this life, you will be hopefully doing for the rest of your career.
Okay, we will end there. Give them a huge round of applause.